Welcome to Nightmare One's Real Horror Movie Channel. If you are a fan of creepy stories, real horror movies, and unsolved mysteries, then Nightmare One's is the place for you. We bring horror stories that have been passed down through generations, movies that recreate real events that make viewers shiver. Each video is not just a movie, but also a door opening to a mysterious world where unimaginable things can happen in real life. Today, we would like to introduce to you a haunting movie called The Red Devil, a story about love, pain, and hatred in the spiritual world. This is not just a simple horror story, but also an emotional tragedy about a grandmother and her grandson. The movie revolves around a grandmother and grandson living together in a small house in a remote countryside. The grandmother always loved and cared for her grandson with all her heart, considering him as the only treasure of her life. But life was never as peaceful as we wished. In a terrible incident, the grandmother died unjustly. Although her body had left the world, her soul remained, determined to protect her little grandson from all lurking dangers. However, that love gradually became a curse. No one could get close to her grandson. No one could take him away from her. Those who intended to hurt her grandson met strange, haunting deaths. From a gentle soul, the grandmother gradually turned into a terrifying entity, a red demon, appearing whenever her grandson was in danger. The story became increasingly terrifying as the child grew up, gradually realizing that her protection was no longer a blessing. It became a haunting shadow, making it impossible for him to have a normal life. And in the end, the most heartbreaking thing happened. He was forced to face the grandmother he loved the most, forced to make the most difficult choice of his life. The ending of The Red Devil is not only haunting, but also leaves a deep sadness in the hearts of viewers. It raises the question, can love overcome all boundaries, even death? And can overprotection become a curse instead of a protection? Let's explore this haunting story in today's video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nightmare One's channel so you don't miss other real horror movies. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next nightmares. 1. Mrs. Diem used her hand to slap Mr. Cam's mouth and shouted loudly, "Open your mouth! I told you to open your mouth so I can feed you porridge." But Mr. Cam shook his head and waved his hands. He clasped his hands and begged. Mrs. Diem still did not forgive him, glaring at him and saying, "If you don't open your mouth and eat properly, don't blame me for pouring this whole bowl of porridge on your head." Mrs. Cam's eyes filled with tears. "I said I can't eat it. Leave it there, and I'll eat it myself later." Mrs. Diem placed the bowl of porridge on a nearby table with a bang. She said angrily, "You are my debt. Why don't you just die?" Old Cam cried. She tried to hold the bowl of porridge to her mouth to sip some water. However, the porridge seemed too fishy. She couldn't eat it. She turned her face away, put the bowl of porridge down on the table and sobbed. But her tears gradually softened because Mrs. Diem was still staring at her. She glanced back at the porridge. The porridge was fishy and smelled of slightly spoiled pork. Mrs. Diem must have bought spoiled meat, which she couldn't eat, so she cooked porridge for her to eat. He thought for a while and then vomited on the ground. Mrs. Diem roared, "Oh my God, I couldn't eat and even threw up. How miserable I am. How stupid are you? Stupid as a pig." Then she rushed forward, grabbed Mr. Cam's head, used her hand to cover his mouth and poured the bowl of porridge into his mouth. While pouring, she shouted, "Here, eat! Eat quickly or I'll kill you!" As the bowl of porridge flowed, the fishy smell rose up, making Mr. Cam struggle. The porridge water splashed onto Mrs. Diem's hand. She became even angrier, poking Mr. Cam's mouth with an iron spoon, trying to force him to eat quickly. After pouring the bowl of porridge, Mr. Cam fainted and stopped vomiting. 2. Mrs. Diem glared at Mr. Cam and went to the water jar to wash his hands. Then she put him on the bed. The porridge water was scattered everywhere, making the room smelly, and she didn't bother to clean it up. For a long time, Mr. Cam's room had always smelled musty, like a toilet. That smell even permeated his clothes, hair, and face. There was no place that didn't smell. That smell made Mrs. Diem treat Mr. Cam like a sick cat, so she disliked him even more. So she was lazy to take care of him. Since Mr. Coe died, no one could control Mrs. Diem. When he was alive, Mr. Coe was strong and had a violent temper, so he often beat her to cure her bad temper. Now that Mr. Coe is gone, no one can control her. After Mrs. Diem left, a few hours later, Mr. Cam woke up. The sticky rice porridge was on his mouth. He tried to get up, waving his hand to chase away the flies that landed on his face, near the pool of rotten rice porridge. He groped for the water jar to wash his hands. But when he turned on the tap, there was not a drop of water. It must have been time for the water plant to cut off. This afternoon, I don't know what Mrs. Diem did that she forgot to turn on the valve, so now there was not a drop of water in the tank. The dirty, rancid porridge water smelled even worse after a few hours of him fainting. Even though he was used to the smell on his body, he could not stand it. He remembered that the old well in the backyard was still there. When Mr. Coe was still alive, this family used to use well water. Only in recent years did they switch to tap water. Mr. Cam crept out to the backyard, lowered the bucket of water into the well to get water to wash up. Duan took the bicycle, parked it temporarily at the fence, then carried the bag of rice he had just bought at the district market from the bike into the house. In the damp kitchen, a few ashes were floating on the stovetop and falling down. Duan kicked the pillar several times to get rid of the dust. Then he hid the bag of rice in the corner of the kitchen. Today, Duan only dared to buy 10 kilos of rice because he was afraid that Mrs. Diem would accidentally find this amount of rice and bring it to Mr. Luck's house for Ba. Ba was Mrs. Diem's illegitimate child with Mr. Luck. Mrs. Diem had an affair with Mr. Luck and became pregnant with Ba when Mr. Coe was still alive. At that time, Mr. Coe went away to work for 3 years. When she returned, Mrs. Diem hid the fact that she had an affair and had a child with another man. At the end of her life, the whole story was gossiped about by the villagers and came to light. Mr. Coe was so angry that he foamed at the mouth and died. Duan ran out to the water tank to wash his face when he suddenly realized that the water in the tank was gone. Duan opened the emergency water valve at the head of the canal, letting water flow into the tank. Usually when Duan was away from home, Mrs. Diem did not pay attention to the water. Whenever water was released from the pumping station and no one was home, clean water overflowed into the tank, which was a waste. Therefore, before leaving the house, Duan usually turned off the main water valve. Only when he returned home and saw that there was no more water did he turn it on. While waiting for the water to fill the tank so he could bathe, Duan ran into the inner room to ask about his grandmother. The door was ajar and a rancid, fishy smell wafted out. Duan wrinkled his nose a little but pushed the door open. As soon as he pushed the door open, Duan saw Mrs. Cum sitting there, chewing betel. She smiled at him and asked, "Your nephew comes home early today?" Duan opened his mouth and smiled from ear to ear. Today, his grandfather was unusually healthy. It had been a long time since Duan had seen Grandfather Diem chewing betel. Duan sat down next to Grandfather Diem, made himself a piece, and stuffed it into his mouth. While chewing, he frowned and asked Grandfather Cam, "What's so good about this that I see you keep chewing it? It's so spicy, I could die." Old Cam just smiled and said nothing. Duan spat the betel nut into the chamber pot near his bed, then wiped his mouth with his hand, then ran out to the water jar to take a bath. Just when Mrs. Diem came back, she saw Duan's red lips and glared at him. "Oh my God, I just had sex with someone in the field." She paused for a moment, then lifted her chin and asked, "Did you bring me some rice? How much?" Duan bowed his head and said nothing, just ran to the water jar, poured cold water on his head, and started scrubbing. When Mrs. Diem saw that Duan did not speak, she angrily rushed into the kitchen. But she could not find the rice. Duan must have hidden it too well today. Her face darkened with discomfort. Anticipating that something bad was about to happen, Duan quickly changed into his shorts, intending to run out and hang around until Mrs. Diem calmed down before returning. Unexpectedly, Duan had just finished changing his pants when Mrs. Diem, holding a mulberry whip, rushed at Duan and whipped him repeatedly. Duan fell face down on the ground, his face covered in blood because his cheek had been scraped against a broken tile. Duan was covered in mud all over his body. Mrs. Diem hissed, "I told you to buy 2 kilos of rice so I could bring it over to take care of your younger brother. But why didn't you listen to me? Do you think my words are empty?" Duan gritted his teeth and did not say anything. It was not because he was afraid of Mrs. Diem that he did not dare to argue back. It was because he was afraid of the filial piety hanging over his head. Mrs. Diem took advantage of the situation to grab Duan's hair, pull his ears, and slapped him in the face, saying, "Your sister is still in school age. If you don't take care of her, who will support this family in the future? You've been stupid all your life. Do you want your sister to be stupid like you, to suffer as a servant like you?" Duan kept his head down and remained silent. After a while, Mrs. Diem had to turn around and go back into the house. She did not forget to leave behind a lingering sentence. "If you disobey me this time, there will be no next time. You hear me? If there is a next time, I won't just beat you up like this." She went into the house, was silent for a moment, then shouted out, "I'll go to Mrs. Han later and take 20 kilos of rice on credit. When you get your salary, bring the money over there to pay." It turned out that Mrs. Diem had thought of a way to get the rice that Duan refused to buy. If he had known this earlier, Duan would have bought 2 pounds of rice for her to avoid a painful beating. Duan was very upset but didn't know what to do. He ran to the water jar and poured several buckets of cold water on his head to vent his anger, also to wash away all the mud stuck to his body. Mrs. Diem went somewhere that evening and returned happily at midnight. Seeing Duan sitting in front of a basin of water, wiping the tear on his face, she said gently, "Rub salt on it, or it will get infected and break open, costing you money to treat it." Duan found it strange that Mrs. Diem suddenly changed her attitude of caring for him like that, but her next words made his heart numb. "Mr. Luke and I are getting married soon, and Ba will also move in together. When he comes back tomorrow, don't bother him with his studies, okay?" Having said that, she turned around and walked into the room with a smile. She seemed very happy, because her long-cherished wish had finally come true. This afternoon, passing by the village temple, Duan heard rumors that Mr. Luke had sold his house because he lost money in the lottery. That was probably why Mr. Luck had no choice but to marry Miss Diem. Moreover, Miss Diem had always been there to take care of his food and accommodation, and Mr. Luck had long relied on her, so he didn't bother to do anything but drink all day. Now that Mr. Luck was down on his luck, Miss Diem must have pumped him to come back here. Duan was so angry that the blood that had already flowed from his cheek suddenly flowed out again. His eyebrows twitched, his fists pressed against the ground until their veins stood out. Mrs. Diem was becoming more and more outrageous. If Mr. Luke returned, the burden of feeding 5 mouths would fall on his head. The entire legacy that Mr. Ko had left behind during his lifetime, no one knew how long it would last. Mrs. Diem kept wandering around in the room, wondering what she was doing that made the whole house so noisy. After a while, she ran out and deliberately grumbled so that Duan could hear. "The wedding is coming soon, but I have nothing to wear on my wedding night." Her face turned red with embarrassment when she thought of Mr. Luck. She was over 40 this year, the age of youthfulness. Mr. Luck's strong and plump figure made her feel even more burning. Her face suddenly looked like she remembered something, but she ran into Mr. Cam's room and started to scold him. "Where is your red dress? Give it here so I can wear it to prepare for the wedding tomorrow." Duan was so angry that his face turned purple that he rushed into Mr. Cam's room, intending to stop Mrs. Diem. However, it was too late. Mrs. Diem had stripped off the red shirt Mr. Cam had been wearing for the past few days, leaving him completely naked. Duan shouted loudly, "What are you doing, Mom? Why are you taking off Grandma's shirt?" Mrs. Diem glared and slapped Duan, then said, "Shut up, or do you have money to buy me a shirt? A poor, ignorant person like you wants to care for others? Worry about keeping yourself warm." After taking off the red shirt of Old Man Cam, she frowned a bit because the shirt had a bad smell, but she quickly smiled and took the shirt out to the water vat to wash it clean. Duan saw Old Man come naked. She was not crying or sad, but still smiling toothlessly, chewing betel. Suddenly tears flowed. Maybe she was too old and lost her mind. Or maybe she had been tortured by Mrs. Diem to the point of insanity. He rummaged through the closet, took an old shirt and put it on her, then said, "Put on your coat or you will catch a cold. When I have money tomorrow, I will buy you another coat." Hearing that, Mrs. Diem shouted shrilly from outside, "He has plenty of clothes to wear that you have to buy. That money is for Ba's education. I forbid you to touch it." Duan was so angry that he punched the wall, causing dust to fall from the wall. Duan was so upset that he felt it was hard to breathe, so he went out, got on his bicycle, and rode out to the communal house. Mrs. Diem saw Duan driving away and called out, "Tomorrow we are preparing a feast. You have to come home early to help. Don't hang around anywhere." Duan ignored Mrs. Diem's words. She could beat, scold, and torture him. But bringing Mr. Luke into this house was one of the taboos. Duan would absolutely not tolerate her actions. If Mr. Luck were here tomorrow and indeed married Mrs. Diem, he would drag Ba out and beat him up to vent his anger. Today, outside the communal house, there was a performance rehearsal for the village performance team. The performance team had a girl that Duan really liked and had noticed for a long time. That girl was Trang. Although Trang was not beautiful, she was very charming. Trang's charm lay in her eyelashes, willow leaf eyelashes that drooped down to the corners of her eyes. Although her eyelashes looked sad, they made people secretly feel pity for her. There were also some guys in the art troupe who were interested in Trang, but those guys were all notorious playboys. Among them, Kong was the person Duan hated the most. Previously, Kong had a bad reputation in the district art troupe for his womanizing, and later, because of his excessive womanizing, he was kicked out of the village by the district. The village was short of people, so he invited Kong to practice art and teach the younger ones. Since joining the village art troupe, Kong had tried to flirt with Trang many times but failed. Duan often hung around to talk to Trang, so every time he saw Duan appear, Kong would call out to the guys in the art troupe to beat him up. Trang knew that Kong was not a good person, so she often tried to stay away from him. Seeing this, Kong thought that Trang was ignoring him because of Duan. He was furious and beat Duan very badly every time. As soon as Duan cycled to the entrance of the communal house, he heard the loud sound of drums and gongs. The young men in the art troupe were performing the play Quan Am Thi Kin. When they saw Duan coming, they threw off their hats and coats and rushed to the communal house gate to block Duan's bicycle. The public shouted loudly, "What are you doing here? Are you trying to tease a good girl? Hit her." As soon as Kong finished speaking, he rushed forward and punched Duan in the face. The young men took advantage of the situation and continued to add more punches. One elbow, another punch, and in no time, Duan was dizzy. The village chief hurriedly ran over and shouted, "What are you guys doing? Everyone was tired from practicing the art show, but now you have the energy to fight so hard?" Seeing the village chief appear, the group of workers stopped and said with a big smile, "We thought it was some guys from the next village, so we beat them up." Who would have thought? Kong helped Duan up and said in a calm voice, "Is that Duan? Damn, why didn't you say anything to let us know?" Who would leave it like that? The village chief, with his eyes half closed, thought the young men were right. Around here, several villages were fighting with each other. Occasionally, young men from other villages would come over to cause trouble and get beaten up by the men of this village. The village chief didn't think it was strange that the Kong used that as an excuse to beat Duan. He ran over and patted Duan on the shoulder, then said with a smile, "Young man, in the past, when bombs and bullets fell everywhere, he was fine. Was it okay?" Duan forced a smile, brushing off the dust on his clothes that had gotten dirty from the beating he received from the Kong gang. Duan glanced inside and saw Trang still practicing some lines, so he asked the village chief, "How is our performance team practicing? Is it time for a break?" The village chief suddenly puffed out his chest and said seriously, "What do you mean by a break? The village festival is in a few days and I haven't even finished half of the play yet." Then he lectured the young people. "It's because you guys are lazy, otherwise it would have been done long ago." Duan regretfully walked away with his bike. He turned his head back to look at Trang before leaving. Just as Trang turned her head and saw Duan, she happily ran over. "Mr. Duan, how long have you been here?" Kong was afraid that Trang would cling to Duan, so he darkened his face and said, "It's very late. Hurry up and practice so we can go home." "Trang, come here with me." Trang hesitated as if she didn't want to go. She whispered to Duan, "After practice, I'll go to the communal house temple. See you there." Trang slipped a small piece of paper into Duan's hand. Duan quickly put it in his pocket, blushed, got on his bike and sped home. When Trang saw Duan had gone, she bowed her head and shyly walked into the temple. When Duan returned home, the lights were off. Perhaps Mrs. Diem had gone to sleep. Looking into Mrs. Cam's room, Duan saw that she was still awake. The flickering hurricane lamp at the head of her bed had never gone out because her room was hidden in a dark corner all year round. Duan saw Mrs. Cam naked. The shirt he had put on her earlier had disappeared somewhere.